My dad's hospice nurse called me at 1:17 in the morning. Her voice was trembling barely more than a terrified whisper. Isaiah, you need to get here right now. Your brother is forcing his hand to sign something. I thought Desmond told the staff you moved out of state, but I found your real number in the old emergency file. Please hurry. I was 36 minutes away. When I finally reached the hospital and kicked open the door to room 204, the scene waiting for me made my blood run completely cold. My name is Isaiah. I am 34 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. What happened that night shattered every illusion I had about blood being thicker than water. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against toxic relatives who tried to steal your legacy. You will definitely want to hear how I took everything back. The rain was coming down in relentless sheets as I sprinted to my car that night. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt as I pulled out of my driveway, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Nurse Brenda's words echoed in my head on an endless loop. Your brother is forcing his hand to sign something. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I should have known Desmond would try something like this. I should have been there. But for the last 6 months, I had been systematically pushed out of my own family. My father Elijah was a legend in our community. He was a proud, hardworking black man who built a wildly successful barbecue franchise and a community center from absolutely nothing. He started with a single rusty smoker and a secret sauce recipe, working 18-hour days to make sure his family never had to struggle the way he did. I idolized him. I spent my childhood organizing his receipts, learning the value of every single dollar he earned. It was why I became a forensic accountant in the first place. I wanted to protect the empire he built. But Desmond, my older brother, had a very different view of our father's legacy. At 38 years old, Desmond was the undisputed golden child of the family. He was loud, charismatic, and always wore a suit that cost more than my first car. He introduced himself to everyone as an elite investment consultant, projecting this image of extreme wealth and success. The reality, which I knew from looking at public tax records, was that Desmond was drowning in debt. He lived entirely on credit, funding his extravagant lifestyle to keep up appearances at his country club. Despite his financial disasters, the extended family worshipped Desmond. My aunts and uncles treated him like royalty because he knew exactly how to charm them, always promising them big returns on fake investments or picking up the tab at expensive dinners using credit cards that were maxed out to the limit. I was the quiet one, the serious brother who asked too many uncomfortable questions about where the money was coming from. Because of that, I became the family scapegoat. I was the one they called boring, pessimistic, and ungrateful. When Dad got sick with terminal cancer, things escalated from subtle favoritism to outright psychological warfare. Desmond immediately took control of Dad's medical care, positioning himself as the devoted, grieving son. He moved Dad into a high-end hospice facility and restricted all the visitor lists. Then he started the smear campaign against me. Desmond told every aunt, uncle, and family friend that I was too obsessed with my career to visit my dying father. He told them I was angry about not getting a bigger inheritance and that I had abandoned the family out of spite. None of it was true. I had tried to visit Dad every single day, but every time I showed up at the facility, the security guards turned me away, saying Desmond had legal medical power of attorney and had specifically banned me from the premises. Desmond even told the nursing staff that I had moved to a different state to avoid dealing with the funeral preparations. He orchestrated a complete blackout, isolating my father and painting me as the villain. And the entire family bought his lies without ever calling me to ask for my side of the story. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the storm as I pushed my car past the speed limit. The highway was completely empty, illuminated only by the harsh glare of the streetlights. My mind raced through all the legal documents Dad had previously filed. He had always been meticulous about his paperwork. Whatever Desmond was forcing him to sign at 1 in the morning, it had to be a new will or a transfer of assets. Desmond was making his final move to steal everything Dad had worked for before the cancer finally took him. I swerved into the hospice parking lot, ignoring the reserved parking signs and throwing my car into park, right in front of the main entrance. The rain soaked through my shirt instantly as I ran toward the sliding glass doors. The lobby was deserted, except for a sleeping security guard at the front desk. I did not stop to ask for directions or sign the visitor log. I already knew exactly where room 204 was, because I had spent the last 3 weeks staring at it from the parking lot, praying for a chance to go inside. My wet shoes squeaked loudly against the polished linoleum floor as I sprinted down the dimly lit hallway. The silence of the hospice wing was suffocating. It smelled of strong antiseptic and impending grief. As I approached the door, I could hear voices. One was Desmond speaking in a low, aggressive hiss. The other was a woman offering soothing but entirely fake words of encouragement. I recognized her voice immediately. It was Chelsea, Desmond's white wife, who always played the innocent victim while helping him destroy our family. I did not knock. I did not announce myself. I planted my foot and shoved the heavy wooden door open with every ounce of strength I had in my body. It crashed against the wall with a deafening bang. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The scene inside room 204 burned itself into my memory like a horrible photograph. The dim fluorescent light above the hospital bed cast a sickly yellow glow over my father. He looked so small and fragile. The broad shoulders that used to carry me around our neighborhood were practically gone, eaten away by the sickness. His eyes were half open, but completely unfocused, clouded by the heavy doses of morphine pumping through his veins. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room until my sudden entrance shattered the silence. Standing on the left side of the bed was Chelsea. She wore a pristine cream-colored cashmere sweater that looked entirely out of place in the room of a dying man. Her face was twisted into a sickeningly sweet smile, but her actions told a completely different story. She was leaning over my father with both of her hands pressing firmly down on his fragile shoulders, pinning him flat against the mattress so he could not pull away. She was whispering soothing words into his ear, telling him that everything would be over soon and that he just needed to rest. It was the most calculated and evil display of false affection I had ever witnessed in my entire life. On the right side of the bed stood Desmond. He did not even have the decency to take off his expensive suit jacket. In his left hand, he held a thick stack of legal documents attached to a heavy wooden clipboard. With his right hand, he was physically gripping the wrist of our father. My dad was trembling weakly, trying to pull his arm back, but he had no strength left to fight. Desmond was violently wedging a heavy silver pen between the limp fingers of our dad. He was literally guiding the hand of our father down toward the bottom of the page, forcing the pen tip onto the signature line. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed at the top of my lungs. Desmond snapped his head up. His eyes went wide with shock for a split second before hardening into a glare of pure hatred. He did not let go of the pen. Instead, he pressed down harder, trying to finish the signature before I could reach him. Chelsea gasped and jumped back from the bed, her hands flying to her mouth as if she were the victim of a sudden attack. "Get out of here, Isaiah!" Desmond shouted back, his voice echoing off the sterile hospital walls. "You have no right to be here. You abandoned him." I did not waste time arguing with his lies. The sight of my helpless father being assaulted by his own son triggered a primal rage deep inside me. I crossed the small hospital room in 3 massive strides. I lunged at Desmond, grabbing him by the collar of his tailored shirt and shoving him hard against the wall. The clipboard slipped from his grasp and crashed onto the linoleum floor, scattering the thick stack of papers everywhere. The silver pen rolled under the hospital bed. Desmond let out a grunt of pain as his back hit the drywall, but he quickly recovered. He has always been bigger than me, and he used his heavy weight to throw a punch that clipped me right on the jaw. My head snapped to the side, but I barely felt the impact. The adrenaline pumping through my system made me numb to everything except the burning need to protect my father from these vultures. I tackled Desmond, grabbing him around the waist and driving him into the small visitor couch in the corner of the room. We crashed down together, knocking over a rolling tray of water cups and medical supplies. Are you insane? I roared, pinning him down with my knee pressing into his chest. He is dying, Desmond. He is out of his mind on painkillers, and you are forcing him to sign legal papers. You are an absolute monster. Desmond struggled beneath me, his face red with exertion and anger. He is fixing his mistakes, he spat back at me. He is leaving his legacy to the son who actually stayed by his side, the son who deserves it. Get off me, you pathetic loser. While we wrestled violently on the floor, Chelsea went into full panic mode. But she did not try to help my father or call a doctor. Instead, she started screaming at the top of her lungs, crying out for help and acting completely terrified. Help us! She shrieked, her voice carrying down the long hospital hallway. Somebody please help us. He is attacking my husband. He is trying to kill us. I managed to look up for a brief second and saw my father shifting weakly on the bed. The loud commotion was deeply distressing him. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe through the clear plastic oxygen mask strapped to his face. His glazed eyes darted around the room until they finally landed on me. He lifted a trembling hand pointing weakly in my direction. Isaiah, he mumbled, his voice so frail and raspy it broke my heart into a million pieces. My boy. You came. I am here, Dad, I yelled back, trying to keep Desmond pinned down on the floor. I am right here. I will not let them hurt you anymore. Desmond used my momentary distraction to drive his knee upward into my stomach. All the air rushed out of my lungs and I fell sideways, gasping for breath. Desmond scrambled to his feet, panting heavily and frantically smoothing down his ruined suit jacket. He completely ignored me and lunged for the scattered papers on the floor. He desperately shuffled the white pages together, looking for the final signature page. I forced myself up, clutching my ribs, and grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around before he could check the document. I got a quick glimpse of the paper in his hand. The words "Last Will and Testament" were printed in bold black ink at the top of the page. The signature line at the bottom had a jagged, messy scrawl across it. It did not even look like human letters. It was just a frantic ink mark made by a dying man who was being physically forced to write against his will. But I knew that in the eyes of the law, a signature was a signature no matter how terrible it looked. Desmond had gotten exactly what he came for in the middle of the night. Before I could grab the paper from his hands, the heavy footsteps of hospital security guards pounded down the hallway. Chelsea ran to the open doorway, weeping hysterically, and pointing a trembling finger right at me. She played her part perfectly, with tears streaming down her pale face as she collapsed into the arms of a confused nurse who had just arrived. He broke in, she sobbed loudly, burying her face in her hands. He broke in and attacked Desmond. He is trying to hurt his own father. Please get him out of here right now. The small room suddenly filled with bodies. 2 large security guards grabbed me from behind, locking my arms tightly behind my back. I struggled against their heavy grip, my boots slipping on the spilled water on the floor. Let go of me, I screamed, trying to shake them off and move toward my dad. Look at the papers. He forced my dad to sign those papers. They are stealing everything from him. Desmond stood tall, tucking the stolen papers neatly into his inner jacket pocket. He looked at the security guards with an expression of calm authority, entirely unfazed by my loud accusations. Please remove my brother from the premises, he said smoothly, while adjusting his expensive shirt cuffs. He is deeply troubled, and he is disrupting the final moments of my father. I have the medical power of attorney. I want him permanently banned from this floor immediately. The guards yanked me backward, dragging my feet across the floor toward the door. I looked past their shoulders and locked eyes with my father one last time. His frail chest stopped heaving. The heavy plastic oxygen mask clouded with one final shallow breath, and then the condensation slowly began to fade away, leaving the clear plastic entirely empty of life. The heavy silver pen slipped from his limp fingers and clattered onto the cold linoleum floor, rolling away under the metal hospital bed frame. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor that had been the agonizing background noise of this nightmare suddenly shifted. It turned into a single high-pitched continuous tone that pierced through the small room like a physical blade. It was the undeniable sound of a flatline, My world completely stopped spinning. I stopped fighting the heavy hands of the two large security guards who were gripping my arms so tightly my shoulders ached. The fiery anger that had been boiling in my veins just seconds ago instantly turned into an ocean of freezing cold despair. Dad. I choked out my voice, cracking under the weight of a sorrow so heavy it physically crushed my chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. Dad, please no. Desmond froze for only a fraction of a second before smoothly tucking the folded legal document deeper into the inside pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He did not look down at the man who had given him life. He did not shed a single tear for the loving father who had just passed away right in front of him. He simply patted his chest pocket to make absolutely sure the stolen legacy was secure against his ribs. Chelsea, on the other hand, immediately sprang into action, performing the most sickening theatrical display of grief I had ever witnessed in my entire life. The exact second that long, flat-line tone filled the sterile room, she threw her hands into the air and let out a blood-curdling shriek that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Oh my God," she wailed, dropping heavily to her knees right beside the hospital bed, clutching the metal rail. "He is gone. My poor, sweet father-in-law is gone." Her loud, hysterical cries echoed down the empty hospital corridor, acting as a terrifying alarm bell. Within seconds, the quiet hallway erupted with the frantic sound of running footsteps squeaking against the polished floor. A dedicated team of doctors and nurses sprinted past the doorway, pushing aggressively past me and the security guards who were still holding me by the entrance. A frantic nurse carrying a heavy red crash cart bumped hard into my shoulder, but I barely felt the physical impact. My eyes were entirely fixed on the lifeless body of my father lying perfectly still on the bed while chaos erupted around him. As the medical team swarmed the small bed, shouting complex medical terms and quickly preparing the defibrillator paddles, Chelsea turned her victim performance up to an entirely new level. She scrambled up from the floor and forcefully grabbed the arm of the lead doctor who was trying to assess the situation. Her pale face was perfectly stained with flowing tears, and her voice trembled with a perfectly manufactured terror that only a master manipulator could produce. It was him, she sobbed loudly, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face while shrinking back into her husband's side. We were just sitting here peacefully holding his hand to say our final goodbyes. But then Isaiah broke into the room like an absolute maniac. I stood there entirely paralyzed by fresh grief and absolute disbelief as she spun her toxic web of lies right over the warm dead body of my father. He violently attacked my husband. Chelsea continued weeping loudly into her hands and shaking her shoulders for dramatic effect. He was screaming and throwing things around the hospital room like a crazy person. It was so violent and so sudden. The terrible shock of the attack was just too much for his weak, failing heart to handle. He scared him to death, Doctor. Isaiah literally killed his own father. Those vicious words hit me harder than the punch Desmond had thrown earlier. She was entirely rewriting reality in real time, using her privilege and her tears to frame me for the death of the man I loved, more than anyone else in the entire world. Several exhausted nurses turned to look at me with expressions of pure disgust and absolute horror on their faces. The two security guards immediately tightened their brutal grips on my arms, treating me no longer like a grieving, heartbroken son, but like a highly dangerous criminal who had just committed a brutal murder. "That is a complete lie!" I yelled, my voice raw and broken from the tears burning in my throat. I was trying to stop them. They physically forced him to sign legal papers while he was unconscious and dying. Check his suit pockets. Desmond has the stolen papers right now. But nobody in that room was listening to the frantic black man being restrained by security. The lead doctor placed the heavy defibrillator paddles firmly on my father's chest, and the loud thud of the electric shock made my stomach violently drop as his lifeless body jerked upward. Desmond stepped forward, placing a highly protective arm around his weeping wife and looking at the busy medical staff with the fake solemn face of a responsible and deeply aggrieved eldest son. "Please do absolutely everything you can to save him," Dr. Desmond said, his voice deep and rich with fake tragedy. And please remove my violently estranged brother from this hospital ward before he causes any more emotional trauma to my poor grieving wife." The medical team administered another desperate shock, but the flatline tone continued its relentless depressing drone. Time of death 1:24 in the morning. The lead doctor finally announced, stepping back from the metal bed and slowly shaking his head in defeat. "No!" I screamed, thrashing wildly against the massive guards who were holding me back from the bed. "Let me go. Let me just say goodbye to him. You cannot let them get away with doing this to him." But the guards showed absolutely no mercy to me. They wrenched my arms painfully high up behind my back and dragged me backward out into the brightly lit hallway. I kicked my legs and fought them desperately, but the sudden heavy grief had drained all the physical strength from my tired muscles. The very last thing I saw before they hauled me roughly around the corner was Desmond standing tall over my father's lifeless body, not mourning or praying, but simply checking the time on his heavy gold wristwatch to ensure the exact time of death matched his newly signed documents. The guards dragged me forcefully through the sterile hospital corridors and across the wide, empty lobby, completely ignoring my frantic pleas and my falling tears. They shoved open the heavy glass entrance doors and physically threw me out into the harsh, freezing rain of the dark night. I stumbled forward blindly and crashed hard onto the wet, rough asphalt of the parking lot, badly scraping the skin off my hands and my knees on the unforgiving ground. "Do not ever come back here," one of the large guards growled, standing safely under the dry, well-lit awning of the main entrance. "If you ever step foot on this hospital property again, we are calling the local police, and we are pressing felony assault charges against you." The heavy automatic sliding doors hissed closed, locking me entirely out in the freezing cold. The violent storm was raging above me, instantly soaking my clothes to the bone and washing away the fresh blood from my scraped hands. I simply sat there, on the wet, freezing pavement, staring blankly up at the dark window of room 204 on the second floor. The freezing rain mingled freely with the hot tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. My father was gone forever. The brilliant man who had built an entire community empire from scratch, who had taught me everything I knew about honor and hard work, had died completely surrounded by greedy, selfish vultures. And those exact same vultures had just successfully stolen his entire life's work while flawlessly painting me to the world as the violent monster. I knelt alone in the freezing rain for what felt like endless, agonizing hours, letting the absolute cold reality of the terrible situation wash completely over me. Desmond truly thought he had won the war tonight. He thought he had completely eliminated the only family member who could ever stand in his selfish way. He honestly thought his expensive tailored suits and his highly manipulative white wife made him entirely untouchable by the law. But as I slowly stood up from the wet, unforgiving asphalt, staring fiercely at the dark hospital building, my crushing, paralyzing grief began to slowly harden into something entirely different and far more dangerous. It hardened into a completely cold and highly calculated professional resolve. Desmond had absolutely no idea that he had just started a brutal war with a forensic accountant who knew exactly how to track every single dirty financial secret he had ever tried to hide. I skipped the funeral entirely. I knew exactly what kind of disgusting circus Desmond would turn it into, and I refused to sit in a crowded church watching him and Chelsea squeeze out fake tears for the local news cameras. The true battle was never going to happen at the cemetery anyway. It was going to happen 3 days later, in the familiar living room of my childhood home. The air inside the house felt incredibly heavy when I walked through the front door. This was the exact same house my father had purchased with the profits from his very first barbecue stand. Every single wooden floorboard and painted wall held a memory of his hard work. Now the living room was packed with folding chairs and extended family members who stopped talking the exact second I walked into the room. Desmond stood near the grand fireplace wearing a custom black suit that probably cost more than a reliable used car. Chelsea stood right beside him wearing a modest black dress and clutching a black leather designer handbag. When she saw me, her eyes immediately darted away, playing the role of the traumatized victim who was terrified to be in the same room as her violent brother-in-law. My aunts and uncles sat in the front row whispering aggressively to each other. Aunt Vivian actually pulled her purse closer to her lap when I walked past her, as if I was going to steal it right there in the open. The poison Desmond had poured into their ears over the last 6 months had completely ruined my reputation. They truly believed I was a greedy, absent son who had abandoned his dying father. Standing at the front of the room behind my father's heavy oak desk was a slick corporate attorney I had never seen before. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried an expensive leather briefcase. He cleared his throat loudly, signaling for the quiet room to settle down. "We are gathered here today to read the final last will and testament of Elijah." The attorney began, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of any real human emotion. He reached into his leather folder and pulled out a few sheets of white paper. My heart started hammering violently against my ribs. I recognized those exact wrinkled pages immediately. They were the very same papers I had watched Desmond shove into his jacket pocket while our father was taking his final dying breath in the hospital room. My hands balled into tight fists, but I forced myself to remain completely still and perfectly silent. As a forensic accountant, I knew that reacting with pure emotion would only give Desmond exactly what he wanted. I needed to hear every single word of this fraudulent document. The attorney droned on for several minutes, reading through the standard legal jargon that establishes a sound mind and body. The irony of those specific words made my blood boil, considering my father was drowning in medical-grade morphine when the pen was forced into his hand. Then the attorney reached the section regarding the division of the estate. "To my eldest son, Desmond, I leave the entirety of my estate," the attorney read, adjusting his glasses. "This includes the primary family residence, all 5 commercial real estate properties currently housing the barbecue franchise locations, the full ownership rights to the business itself, and all associated corporate bank accounts." A collective murmur of approval rippled through the seated family members. Aunt Vivian nodded her head enthusiastically, muttering something about how Desmond deserved it for being such a good and faithful boy. Desmond simply looked down at the floor, trying to fake a look of humble gratitude, but I could see the rigid tension of pure greed in his jaw. The attorney flipped to the second page, and the room went completely dead silent. Everyone knew it was my turn. "To my youngest son, Isaiah," the attorney continued, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, "I leave absolutely 0 financial assets, 0 property, and 0 shares in the family business." The words felt like a physical slap across the face, but the attorney was not finished yet. He took a slow breath and read the final, incredibly cruel sentence. "Instead, I leave Isaiah only my total and complete forgiveness for his deeply unfilial behavior, his chronic selfishness, and his shameful absence during the most difficult days of my life." The sheer disrespect of that sentence echoed off the walls of the living room. My father would never have written those words. My dad was a man who barely finished high school. He spoke with his warm heart and his calloused hands, never with cold, calculated corporate insults like unfilial behavior. That specific word was a massive, glaring mistake. It was the exact kind of pretentious vocabulary that Desmond used when he wanted to sound smarter than everyone else in the room. Desmond had clearly drafted this entire document himself on his laptop, carefully writing a script that would legally steal the empire and simultaneously humiliate me in front of the entire family. The relatives in the room immediately turned their heads to stare at me. I could feel their heavy, judgmental gazes burning into my skin. Chelsea covered her mouth with her delicate hand, pretending to be shocked by the harsh words, but I could clearly see the vicious little smile pulling at the corners of her lips. She was thoroughly enjoying my public humiliation. I did not yell, and I did not throw a fit like they all desperately wanted me to do. Instead, I stood up very slowly from my chair in the back of the room. The whispering instantly stopped. "I want to see that document," I said, my voice completely flat and terrifyingly calm. The attorney frowned and instinctively pulled the paper closer to his chest. "This is a highly irregular request," he stammered, looking nervously over at Desmond for guidance. I am a direct descendant and a legally named party in that document, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. State law grants me the absolute right to inspect the physical signature on that page right now. Hand it over before I call the police and report a stolen estate. The attorney swallowed hard and reluctantly handed the wrinkled paper across the desk. I took it carefully and stared down at the bottom of the page. Right there on the signature line was the jagged, messy scrawl of black ink. It was an absolute disaster of a signature. It did not resemble human letters at all. It was just a frantic, violent mark made by a dying man who had absolutely no idea what was happening to him. I stared at the dark ink, and I could almost see the heavy silver pen being violently pressed into my father's limp hand by his own greedy son. "This is a complete and utter fraud," I announced, turning around to face the crowded living room. I held the paper up high so everyone could see the jagged, messy ink. My father did not write this garbage. Desmond forced a pen into his hand while he was heavily drugged on morphine at 1 in the morning. I saw him do it with my own 2 eyes. The room erupted into loud gasps. Aunt Vivian stood up, knocking her folding chair backward onto the hardwood floor. "How dare you come into this house and disrespect your brother?" she yelled, her voice shaking with self-righteous anger. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Desmond, who was now staring at me with a look of absolute cold-blooded murder. The battle lines were officially drawn, and the war for my father's legacy had just begun. Aunt Vivian stood there, breathing heavily with her hands planted firmly on her wide hips. She glared at me as if I was a total stranger who had just broken into her home. I looked around the crowded living room, desperately searching for a single friendly face. I looked at Uncle Marcus, who had taught me how to ride a bike when I was 7 years old. I looked at Aunt Beatrice, who used to bake me peach cobbler every Sunday after church. Every single one of them refused to meet my eyes. They stared down at the hardwood floor, or they stared directly at Desmond with expressions of blind, unwavering loyalty. "I am telling you the absolute truth," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room so they all had to look at me. Our father was on his absolute deathbed. He was heavily medicated with severe doses of hospital-grade morphine. He could not even speak his own name, let alone legally consent to signing away his entire life savings and his business. Desmond and Chelsea went into his hospital room at 1 in the morning, and they physically forced his hand to move across that paper. That is not a valid signature. That is a brutal physical assault, and it is elder abuse. Uncle Marcus suddenly stood up from the beige sofa, crossing his thick, muscular arms over his chest. He was a large, imposing man with a booming voice that used to command deep respect in our family. "You need to watch your mouth right now, boy." Uncle Marcus growled, his face turning a dark, angry shade of red. "You have absolutely no right to come into this house and throw these wild, disrespectful accusations at your brother. Desmond has been the one taking care of the massive hospital bills. Desmond has been the one sitting faithfully by your father's side while you were busy playing fancy corporate accountant in the city." I could not believe what I was hearing. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the massive, heartbreaking betrayal unfolding right in front of me. "I was not absent, Uncle Marcus," I pleaded, looking directly into his cold eyes. "Desmond explicitly banned me from the hospital floor. He used his temporary medical power of attorney to tell the security guards to keep me out of the building. He lied to all of you so he could completely isolate Dad and steal the barbecue franchise while nobody was looking." That was when Aunt Vivian let out a loud, mocking laugh that completely shattered any remaining hope I had for my family. "You are just bitter, Isaiah," she said, waving her hand dismissively in the humid air of the living room. "You are bitterly jealous because your father finally saw you for who you really are, and he decided to leave the family legacy in the hands of someone who actually knows how to build real wealth. Desmond has a massive vision for the barbecue chain. He is going to franchise it across the entire state, and he is bringing the whole family with him to the top." The dark truth hit me like a physical punch straight to the gut. I looked over at Desmond, who was standing quietly near the brick fireplace, with his hands neatly folded in front of him. A tiny, arrogant smirk played at the corners of his mouth. It all made perfect, terrifying sense now. Desmond did not just brainwash them with pathetic lies about my absence. He bought their loyalty with stolen money. He promised you a cut, did he not? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, low whisper that easily carried through the quiet, tense room. How much did it cost him to buy your complete silence? How much of my father's blood and sweat did Desmond promise to hand over to you just so you would look the other way? Aunt Beatrice, who had been perfectly quiet this entire time, finally spoke up from her comfortable chair in the corner. Do not speak to your elders like that, she snapped sharply, adjusting her floral dress. Desmond is doing exactly what your father always wanted. He is keeping the wealth inside the family where it belongs. He is giving us a guaranteed 10% ownership stake in the new corporate franchise expansion. We are finally going to see the profits from all those long, hard years we spent helping your father clean the restaurant floors and serving food at the summer community cookouts. You just want to keep everything for yourself because you are a greedy little boy who never respected our hard work. I felt completely sick to my stomach. 10%. That was the magic number. Desmond had successfully purchased the soul of our entire extended family for 10% of a business he did not even build. They were perfectly willing to overlook the incredibly fake signature, the heavy doses of morphine, and the late-night hospital assault because Desmond had dangled a fat paycheck right in front of their greedy faces. They were willingly selling out their own brother who had just died and their own nephew for a small fraction of the barbecue empire. Chelsea saw that I was completely outnumbered, and she immediately seized the golden opportunity to play her absolute favorite role. She stepped out from behind Desmond, clutching a white tissue to her chest and looking at the seated family with wide, innocent, terrified eyes. It simply breaks my heart to see him acting like this, she said, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. Desmond has been working so incredibly hard to honor his father's dying wishes and to make sure all of you are taken care of financially. And Isaiah just comes in here screaming and threatening everyone. I am honestly starting to feel very unsafe in this house right now. Her highly manipulative words worked like absolute magic on the greedy relatives. Uncle Marcus took a heavy, threatening step toward me, puffing out his broad chest and balling his hands into tight fists. You need to leave right now, Isaiah, he demanded, pointing a thick, calloused finger toward the front door. You are upsetting Chelsea, and you are deeply disrespecting this entire family. You are no longer welcome in this house ever again. I looked around the room one last time, letting the painful reality burn itself into my memory. I looked at the faded family photos hanging on the walls, showing happier times that felt like a complete lie now. I looked at the worn-out rug where my father used to sit and read the newspaper every Sunday morning. The house looked exactly the same, but the people sitting inside it had turned into complete, absolute monsters. The betrayal from my aunts and uncles cut much deeper than anything Desmond could have ever done on his own. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had chosen a fake 10% promise over the undeniable truth. You are all going to deeply regret this, I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or emotion now. Desmond is going to bleed this company entirely dry, just like he bleeds his own credit cards dry to pay for his country club lifestyle. And when the entire empire completely collapses, you will all have absolutely nothing to show for selling your souls to him. Desmond finally stepped forward, dropping his fake, humble, grieving son act for just a brief second. His eyes were cold and dead as he looked down his nose at me. Goodbye, Isaiah, he said, his voice smooth and dripping with pure poison. If you ever try to contact any of these people again, I will personally have my lawyer file a permanent restraining order against you. I did not say another word to any of them. I simply turned my back on the entire crowded room and walked out the front door, stepping off the porch of the only home I had ever known. I was entirely ostracized from my own bloodline, cast out into the cold. As I walked down the long driveway toward my parked car, I realized I was completely alone in this terrifying legal fight. But being completely alone also meant I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and I was ready to destroy them all. I stopped halfway down the long gravel driveway. The cold wind hit my face, but my blood was running entirely too hot to just walk away and let them win so easily. A sudden realization hit me hard. The only way to legally destroy that fake will was to prove my father was completely incapacitated at the exact time the document was signed. I needed the physical medical logs and the detailed medication charts from the hospice center. Without that concrete evidence, it was just my word against a wealthy couple and a room full of greedy relatives. I spun around on my heels and marched right back up the wooden steps. I pushed the heavy oak front door wide open, stepping back into the tense living room. The room was already buzzing with excited chatter about their new franchise shares, but every single person froze the second I walked back inside. The corporate attorney looked nervously at his expensive leather briefcase. "I am not leaving until you show me the official hospice medical records," I demanded, my voice echoing loudly off the walls of the childhood house. "I want the exact dosage logs from the night he died. I want the toxicology report and the nurse administration charts. As a direct blood relative, I have a legal right to request a full medical audit right here and right now." Desmond immediately stepped in front of the nervous attorney, physically blocking my view of the legal files on the desk. "You have absolutely no rights here anymore, Isaiah," he said, his voice dripping with pure arrogance and complete disdain. "You were written completely out of this family and this estate. If you want to see any medical paperwork, you can hire a private lawyer and subpoena them through the court system. But we all know you do not have the money to fight me in a prolonged legal battle. Now get the hell out of my house before I have you physically removed from the property." "I am not afraid of you, Desmond," I yelled, taking a firm, deliberate step forward. I pointed a finger directly at his chest. "You cannot hide the morphine logs forever. The hospice center keeps strict digital backups, and I will find every single nurse who was on the floor that night. I will depose all of them under oath until someone finally admits exactly what you did to him." That was when Chelsea made her ultimate move. She saw that Desmond was actually losing control of the situation, and she knew exactly how to shut me down permanently. She gasped loudly, putting her pale hand over her chest and backing away as if I had just pulled a deadly weapon on her. She stumbled dramatically against the brick fireplace mantel, knocking over a small framed photograph of my grandfather. Then she reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out her newest model smartphone. Her face instantly transformed from the smug, arrogant smirk she had been wearing all morning into a deeply convincing mask of absolute sheer terror. Her hands started visibly shaking as she quickly dialed 3 short numbers and pressed the phone tightly to her ear. She took a deep, ragged breath, and when she spoke, her voice was high-pitched and trembling with perfectly manufactured panic. "Hello, please send the police immediately!" she cried into the receiver, letting a loud, desperate sob escape her throat. "Please hurry. There is a large, aggressive black man threatening me and my family inside my own home. He is acting completely erratic and he is refusing to leave the property. I am so terrified he is going to physically hurt my husband and me. Please, you have to send armed officers right now before he does something violent." The specific words she chose were incredibly intentional and completely deadly. Weaponized white women's tears. It is a highly dangerous, manipulative tactic that has historically cost so many innocent black men their lives and their freedom. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew exactly what could happen to a tall, frustrated, and deeply grieving black man when heavily armed police officers arrived at a tense, chaotic scene where a wealthy, crying white woman was claiming she feared for her very life. The entire dynamic of the room shifted in a single terrifying second. My heart dropped entirely into my stomach. This was no longer just a bitter family argument over a stolen inheritance or a fake signature on a fraudulent will. This was a direct, calculated threat to my actual life. Uncle Marcus immediately took a heavy step forward and reached for the thick brass fireplace poker standing next to the brick hearth. He held it tightly in his large, calloused hand, gripping it like a medieval weapon to protect the crying white woman from his own flesh and blood nephew. I looked around the room and saw the terrified, hostile faces of my own family members. They had completely bought into her hysterical, theatrical performance. If the local police arrived and saw me standing there yelling and demanding paperwork, they would not ask any sensible questions. They would simply see a massive threat, and they would eliminate it exactly like Chelsea wanted. She was intentionally trying to get me arrested or shot so I could never challenge the fake will in a real court of law. I had to suppress every single natural urge to scream and fight back for my father's honor. Survival was the only thing that mattered right now in this dangerous moment. I raised both of my empty hands slowly into the air, showing everyone in the living room and the imaginary police dispatcher on the phone that I had absolutely no weapons and no violent intentions whatsoever. I kept my physical movements incredibly slow and completely deliberate. "You win this round, Chelsea," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, steady whisper so she could hear me over her own fake sobs. But the truth always comes out eventually. I slowly backed away toward the front door, never taking my eyes off her terrified fake expression or Uncle Marcus holding the heavy brass poker. I stepped backwards out onto the front porch and immediately turned around, sprinting down the long driveway toward my parked car. I fumbled frantically with my keys, my hands shaking violently from the massive adrenaline dump coursing through my veins. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door locked immediately, putting the car into reverse. As I sped away down the quiet, wealthy suburban street, the distant wail of multiple police sirens began to echo loudly through the neighborhood. They were already coming for me based on a complete malicious lie. I drove the opposite way, keeping my head down and my speed exactly at the legal limit to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention from the passing patrol cars. My chest heaved heavily as I realized how incredibly close I had just come to losing absolutely everything, including my life. Desmond and Chelsea were playing a truly evil and deadly game with zero rules. If I was going to beat them and save my father's legacy, I could not do it by kicking down doors and demanding answers. I had to completely outsmart them using my own professional skills. I had to become an invisible ghost in their corrupt financial machine. I did not make it past the end of the neighborhood. Two heavy police cruisers turned the corner with their sirens blaring and their lights flashing brightly in the morning air. They aggressively swerved right into the middle of the street, completely blocking my path to the main road. I immediately put my car in park and kept my hands flat on the top of the steering wheel where they could easily see them. Three armed officers stepped out of their vehicles with their hands resting dangerously close to their holsters. They approached my car window and ordered me to step outside slowly. Chelsea had clearly given them a terrifying and completely exaggerated description because they treated me like a highly dangerous suspect who had just committed a violent home invasion. They patted me down roughly against the side of my own car, while several of our wealthy neighbors watched safely from their manicured front lawns. I calmly explained that it was my childhood home and that I was already leaving the property voluntarily, but they did not care about my side of the story. They formally escorted me back to the property line, where Desmond was standing on the front porch with a deeply smug and satisfied smile on his face. The lead police officer handed me a formal written trespass notice and told me that if I ever stepped foot on the family property again, I would be immediately arrested and thrown in the county jail. I was officially exiled from my own family history by the people who were supposed to love me. I drove back to my small apartment in the city, feeling completely numb and entirely defeated. I did not sleep for a single minute that night. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, staring blankly at the dark wall, while my mind raced through every possible legal strategy. I knew I needed a highly aggressive probate lawyer to contest the fraudulent will, but those specialized attorneys required massive financial retainers up front. Thankfully, I had a very lucrative career as a senior forensic accountant at one of the most prestigious financial firms in the city. I planned to go into the office early, request an emergency cash advance on my annual corporate bonus, and use my professional network to find the absolute best estate lawyer in the entire state. I showered, put on my sharpest gray tailored suit, and drove to the downtown financial district, completely determined to fight back and clear my father's name. The towering glass building of my accounting firm usually made me feel incredibly powerful and deeply respected. I walked through the polished marble lobby and rode the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. But the exact second the elevator doors slid open, I knew something was horribly wrong. My administrative assistant would not even look me in the eye when I walked past her busy desk. Before I could even sit down in my ergonomic chair and turn on my computer, the Director of Human Resources walked directly into my office. He was flanked closely by the senior managing partner of the entire firm. They both had incredibly grim expressions on their aging faces, and they asked me to follow them into the main glass conference room immediately. I sat down at the long mahogany table, feeling a sudden wave of cold nausea wash over my entire body. The managing partner slid a thick manila folder across the polished table toward me. He folded his hands tightly and told me that the firm had received a very disturbing legal complaint first thing this morning. He explained that the new legal owner of the Elite Barbecue franchise, which had been a highly valued legacy client of our firm for over a decade, had just filed a formal ethical grievance against me. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. Desmond had not just stolen the lucrative family business. He was now weaponizing that exact business against my professional career. The managing partner looked at me with deep disappointment and slowly explained the damaging contents of the folder. Desmond had submitted completely fabricated financial reports claiming that I had been secretly embezzling thousands of dollars from the barbecue franchise accounts while I was managing my father's corporate books last year. He boldly accused me of funneling the stolen money into hidden offshore accounts and illegally manipulating the state tax documents to cover my tracks. I stared at the managing partner in absolute disbelief. I told him it was a complete and malicious lie, and that my corrupt brother was actively trying to steal my entire inheritance by ruining my professional credibility. I practically begged them to look at the actual accounting logs because my daily work was always perfectly flawless and completely transparent. The Human Resources Director shook his head slowly, refusing to listen to my desperate pleas. He told me that because we were a top-tier forensic accounting firm, our clean public reputation was our most valuable corporate asset. They could not legally or ethically employ an accountant who was currently under an active criminal investigation for corporate embezzlement. The managing partner coldly informed me that I was being placed on an immediate and indefinite suspension without pay, pending a full internal and external legal investigation into my brother's claims. They demanded that I hand over my corporate security badge, my company credit card, and my highly encrypted work laptop right there on the spot. The sheer brilliance of Desmond's evil plan hit me so hard I could barely breathe. He did not file the fake complaint because he actually thought he could prove I stole anything from our father. He filed the complaint because he knew the standard strict corporate policy would force my firm to suspend me immediately. He was intentionally cutting off my entire source of income. He knew that without my monthly salary and my annual bonus, I would never be able to afford the expensive retainer fee for a top-tier probate lawyer. He was financially bleeding me out, so I could not afford to fight him in the probate court. For the second time in less than 24 hours, I was treated like a common dangerous criminal. A uniformed corporate security guard was called into the glass conference room to oversee my departure. He stood right behind my chair and waited silently while I emptied my suit pockets and handed over the plastic security badge I had worked so incredibly hard to earn over the last 5 years. The heavy-set guard then escorted me out of the glass conference room down the long, quiet corporate hallway and into the crowded elevator. My coworkers all stared at me through the clear glass walls of their offices, whispering quietly to each other as I walked past them with my head held high, but my entire career completely shattered. I was escorted out through the grand marble lobby and pushed out onto the busy city street. I stood alone on the crowded sidewalk watching the busy city traffic rush past me. I had absolutely no job, no steady income, no loyal family, and no legal access to my own father's massive estate. Desmond and Chelsea had successfully stripped away every single layer of my comfortable life in just a matter of days. They had backed me into a dark, isolated corner and effectively tied my hands securely behind my back. But as I stood there in my tailored gray suit, breathing in the cold, harsh city air, a dangerous kind of clarity suddenly washed over my mind. They thought that taking away my corporate job would make me completely powerless. They did not realize that by taking away my daily office responsibilities, They had just given me the one specific thing I needed most to completely destroy their lives. They had just given me unlimited free time. I spent the next 2 days sitting in my small apartment meticulously tracking the daily habits of the one person who could possibly save me. Nurse Brenda. I knew I could not go anywhere near the hospice center because the security guards had my photo and strict orders to arrest me on site. But I also knew that Brenda worked 12-hour shifts and lived in a modest neighborhood just a few miles away. I used basic public records to find her home address and figured out her usual commuting route. I needed to catch her completely off guard in a neutral location where Desmond and his corrupt money had absolutely no eyes or ears. On a cold, cloudy Thursday evening, I parked my car at the far edge of a large grocery store parking lot situated right between the hospice center and her house. I sat deep in the shadows of my driver's seat with the engine turned off, watching the glowing neon sign of the supermarket. My stomach was completely empty, but I could not bring myself to eat anything. The heavy weight of the situation was crushing me. If Brenda refused to help me, I had absolutely no legal case against my brother. I would lose my father's legacy, my career, and my entire future, all in one devastating blow. After 3 agonizing hours of waiting, I finally saw her familiar silver sedan pull into the parking lot. She parked a few rows away from the store entrance and walked slowly toward the sliding glass doors. She looked incredibly exhausted. Her shoulders were slumped and she moved with the heavy, tired steps of a woman who had spent all day watching people pass away. I waited patiently for her to do her shopping. 20 minutes later, she emerged carrying 2 plastic grocery bags. This was my only chance. I stepped out of my car and walked briskly across the damp asphalt, keeping my head low until I was standing right beside her vehicle. "Brenda," I said softly as she was fumbling with her car keys. She physically jumped, dropping one of the plastic bags onto the wet ground. Apples and cans of soup rolled across the dark pavement. She gasped, pressing a hand tightly to her chest when she recognized my face in the dim amber light of the parking lot street lamp. "Isaiah, what in the world are you doing here?" she whispered fiercely, her eyes darting around the empty parking lot in pure panic. "You cannot be here right now. You need to leave before somebody sees us talking." I dropped to my knees on the wet asphalt and started gathering her spilled groceries, putting the bruised apples back into the plastic bag. "I am not leaving until you talk to me, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice calm but entirely desperate. "You are the one who called me that night at 1:17 in the morning. You told me to hurry because Desmond was forcing him to sign those papers. You know exactly what happened in that hospital room, and you are the only living witness who can prove that my brother murdered our father with a fraudulent will. I need you to come to the probate court and testify under oath." She snatched the grocery bag from my hands and quickly threw it into the back seat of her car. Her hands were shaking violently. "I cannot do that," she said, her voice trembling with a sickening mixture of deep guilt and genuine fear. "I cannot go to court for you, Isaiah. Your brother is a highly dangerous man. Do you have any idea what he did the morning after your father passed away? He walked straight into the facility director's office and made a massive $50,000 charitable donation to the hospice board. It was a thinly veiled bribe, and everyone in the entire building knew exactly what it meant." I stood up slowly, staring at her in shock. $50,000. I repeated the number, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. He stole millions from my father and used a tiny fraction of it to completely buy the silence of the medical staff. Brenda shook her head sadly, wiping a stray tear from her tired eyes. "It is not just the bribe," she explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The director called me into his office right after Desmond left. He told me that if I ever spoke to you or any legal authority about what happened that night, I would be immediately terminated for violating patient confidentiality laws." I pleaded with her, telling her that the medical board would protect whistleblowers who exposed elder abuse. But Brenda just let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I am 62 years old, Isaiah," she said, leaning heavily against the side of her car. I am exactly 3 years away from collecting my full retirement pension. I have a disabled husband at home who relies entirely on my health insurance. If I lose this job, I lose absolutely everything we have worked for our entire lives. I cannot risk my family just to save yours. I am so incredibly sorry about what they did to your father, but I cannot be your savior in a courtroom. Her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She was not a bad person. She was just an exhausted working-class woman who was being brutally crushed under the heavy weight of my brother's stolen wealth. I could not force her to destroy her own life to fix mine. My last tiny shred of hope completely vanished into the cold night air. I nodded slowly, feeling a profound sense of total defeat washing over my entire body. "I understand," I said softly, stepping back from her car. "I am sorry I scared you tonight, Brenda. Please have a safe drive home." I turned around and started walking back toward the dark shadows where my car was parked. I felt like a dead man walking. Without her testimony, the fake will was legally bulletproof. But before I could take more than 10 steps, I heard the heavy thud of her car trunk slamming shut. "Isaiah, wait!" She called out, her voice suddenly sharp and urgent. I stopped and turned around. Brenda was walking quickly toward me, carrying something in her hands. She closed the distance between us and practically shoved a battered old cardboard shoebox into my chest. I stumbled backward instinctively, wrapping my arms around the worn cardboard. The box was surprisingly heavy and secured tightly with several thick rubber bands. "What is this?" I asked, looking down at the faded shoe logo on the lid. Brenda looked nervously over her shoulder one last time before stepping close to me. "Your dad knew exactly what Desmond was planning," she whispered urgently. "He was physically weak, but he was not stupid. The day before he died, he begged me to hide this box underneath his mattress. He made me swear on a Bible that if anything suspicious happened to him, I would find a way to get this directly into your hands and no one else." I stared at the dirty shoebox, feeling a sudden electric jolt of adrenaline shoot straight through my veins. Brenda took a step back, her face tight with anxiety. "I can never testify for you in a court of law, Isaiah," she said firmly. "And if anyone ever asks, I will swear I have absolutely no idea where you got that box. But your father was a truly good man, and he loved you more than anything in this world. This is everything he managed to save for you, and I kept my promise to him." She turned around, quickly got into her silver sedan, and sped out of the parking lot, leaving me standing completely alone under the flickering street lamp, holding the very last surviving piece of my father's legacy. I drove back to my small apartment with the cardboard box sitting on the passenger seat. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs the entire way home. I locked my front door, deadbolted it, and walked straight into the small kitchen. I cleared away the massive pile of unpaid bills on my tiny wooden dining table and set the worn shoebox right in the center. The thick rubber bands snapped loudly as I pulled them off and lifted the faded cardboard lid. Inside, there was no stack of hidden cash, and there were no secret legal documents. There was only a thick, dark brown leather-bound planner. It was the exact same planner my father used to carry with him every single day when I was a kid. The leather was deeply scuffed, and the corners of the pages were severely dog-eared from years of constant use. I carefully lifted it out of the box, feeling the familiar worn texture under my fingertips. I opened the planner to the very first page, expecting to find a heartfelt letter or a hidden message. Instead, I found nothing but my father's messy handwriting detailing incredibly mundane daily activities. He wrote about the weather, the grocery lists, and the basic maintenance schedule for the barbecue smokers. I flipped through the crisp pages, feeling a sudden cold wave of deep disappointment wash over me. I thought Brenda had made a terrible mistake, or that my father was simply confused in his final days. I read through an entry from last December. The handwriting was slightly shaky but perfectly legible. It said the temperature today was 85 degrees, and I bought 12 pounds of ribs for the Sunday cookout. I stared at that specific sentence for a long time. Something about it felt completely wrong to me. My forensic accounting brain, which had been trained to spot even the tiniest financial inconsistencies, suddenly clicked into high gear. I lived in this city my entire life, and I knew for an absolute fact that the weather in December never reached 85 degrees. It was freezing cold and snowing last December. I looked closely at the second part of the sentence. Buying 12 pounds of ribs made absolutely no sense for a man who owned a massive commercial barbecue franchise that ordered premium meat by the ton every single week. He would never buy 12 individual pounds of ribs for a Sunday cookout. I practically sprinted to my small home office and grabbed my personal laptop, a stack of blank legal pads, and 4 different colored highlighters. I rushed back to the kitchen table and began to meticulously comb through every single page of that weathered leather planner. I read the entries out loud to myself, letting the strange patterns slowly reveal themselves in the quiet apartment. In late January, he wrote that the delivery truck drove 42 miles to pick up 6 bags of charcoal. In early March, he noted that the kitchen timer beeped for 28 minutes straight while he checked 3 separate meat thermometers. The numbers were highly specific, but completely illogical for the context of running his actual business. I started writing the bizarre numbers down in a long column on my yellow legal pad: 85 and 12, 42 and 6, 28 and 3. I stared at the raw data for over an hour, drinking 3 cups of black coffee to keep my exhausted mind completely sharp. I needed to understand the underlying logic of his code. My father was a brilliant businessman, but he was entirely old school. He did not use complicated digital encryption. He used practical numbers that he interacted with every single day: degrees, miles, minutes, pounds, and bags. Then it finally hit me like a massive bolt of lightning. I added 2 zeros to the end of the first number in each sequence, and I looked at the second number as a specific date. 85 became $8,500. 12 became the 12th day of the month. I quickly cross-referenced the rest of my notes. 42 became $4,200 on the 6th day of the month. 28 became $2,800 on the 3rd day of the month. My father was not tracking the weather or the grocery inventory. He was tracking cold hard cash that was mysteriously vanishing from his corporate bank accounts. I worked frantically through the entire night, flipping page after page of the worn leather planner. I transcribed every single coded entry into a massive digital spreadsheet on my laptop. As the columns of numbers grew longer, the horrifying truth of what Desmond had been doing for the last 4 years became undeniably clear. Every single time my father recorded a strange temperature or a bizarre mileage number, it perfectly correlated with the exact days that Desmond was supposed to be helping him manage the franchise deposits at the local bank. Desmond had convinced our dad to let him handle the weekly cash transfers, claiming it would take the heavy physical burden off his aging shoulders. But instead of depositing the restaurant profits, Desmond had been quietly skimming massive amounts of cash right off the top to fund his incredibly fake elite lifestyle. My father had noticed the missing money almost immediately. He was far too sharp to let thousands of dollars simply vanish without a trace. But instead of confronting Desmond right away, he started keeping this secret shadow ledger. He tracked every single stolen dime, waiting to see exactly how greedy his oldest son would actually get. The final page of the planner contained a single entry dated just 2 weeks before my father was admitted to the hospice center. The handwriting was incredibly weak and barely legible. It simply said the grand total temperature is 120 degrees, $1.2 million. Desmond had successfully embezzled over $1 million from the family business over the course of 4 years. The morning sun began to slowly peek through my small apartment window, casting a pale yellow light over the massive piles of paper scattered across my kitchen table. My eyes were burning with pure exhaustion, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. Desmond had stolen my father's money, and then he had the absolute audacity to file a fake human resources complaint accusing me of the exact same crime. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly by using cash and completely locking me out of the corporate accounts. But he had fundamentally underestimated our father. This old leather planner was not just a simple diary. It was a meticulously documented financial confession written by the victim himself. It was the absolute, ultimate weapon. With this shadow ledger, I could easily trace the missing cash deposits and demand a full federal audit of Desmond's personal bank accounts. But I knew that taking this directly to the local police would be a massive mistake. Desmond would just use his expensive lawyers to delay the investigation for years. If I wanted true justice, I had to destroy him publicly in a place where his lawyers could not save him. I had to let him walk directly into his own trap. I carefully closed the leather planner and placed it back inside the shoebox. I finally had the ammunition I needed to win this war. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the dark brown leather planner resting inside the old cardboard shoebox. The profound weight of the shadow ledger was sitting heavy on my mind, but a strange nagging feeling suddenly washed over me. I had successfully decoded the stolen money, but something about the physical book itself still felt entirely unresolved. I reached into the box and picked up the planner one more time. I weighed it carefully in both of my hands. For a simple calendar notebook containing less than 100 pages of thin paper, it felt unnaturally heavy. I ran my thumb along the edges of the binding. The front cover was pliable and worn from years of use, but the back cover was incredibly rigid. It did not bend at all when I applied pressure to the dark leather. I turned the planner over and inspected the thick stitching along the spine. Right near the bottom edge there was a tiny fray in the heavy cotton thread. It looked as if someone had carefully sliced the stitching and then glued it back together. My heart started to race again. I stood up from the table and walked quickly into the kitchen. I opened the silverware drawer and pulled out a sharp paring knife. I returned to the table and sat down, taking a deep breath before I pressed the sharp tip of the blade directly into the frayed seam of the leather binding. I carefully sliced upward along the spine, cutting through the old glue and the heavy threads. The dark brown leather slowly peeled back, revealing the thick cardboard structural backing of the cover. My breath caught completely in my throat. Right in the absolute center of the cardboard there was a perfect rectangular cutout. Resting silently inside that hidden hollow space was a small flat silver key. I set the knife down and gently pulled the key out of its hiding place. The metal was cold against my warm skin. I held it up to the pale morning light streaming through my kitchen window. It was unquestionably a bank safe deposit box key. Engraved on the flat silver head of the key was a specific numerical code and the faint logo of a small regional branch bank located way out in the quiet suburbs of the city. It was a bank that my father never used for his official corporate franchise accounts. He deliberately chose a quiet branch completely outside the city limits, so Desmond would never accidentally stumble across it. But the key was not the only thing hidden inside the hollowed-out cover. Tucked neatly beneath where the key had been resting was a tiny folded square of yellow paper. My hands trembled violently as I reached into the cutout and retrieved the small piece of paper. It was a standard office sticky note folded over on itself 3 times to make it small enough to fit inside the secret compartment. I slowly unfolded the yellow paper, being incredibly careful not to tear the fragile creases. The ink was slightly faded, but there was absolutely no mistaking the messy, sprawling handwriting. It was my dad. I stared at the short message written on the paper, and I felt a massive lump form instantly in my throat. The words were written with a heavy, desperate pressure. He wrote that Desmond was stealing from the family, and that he already knew everything about it. The final sentence was not just a simple statement, it was a direct, dying plea from a father to his youngest son. He explicitly told me to not let his oldest son take the restaurant. The few tears that I had been desperately fighting back all night finally spilled over my eyelashes and rolled down my exhausted face. A single tear landed directly on the edge of the yellow sticky note, blurring the blue ink just a little bit. For the past 6 months, I had been completely tormented by the terrible thought that my father had died believing the vicious lies Desmond told him about me. I thought he had passed away thinking I was an ungrateful, absent son who cared more about my corporate career than my own family. But this tiny yellow piece of paper completely shattered that toxic lie. My father knew the absolute truth the entire time. He knew that Desmond was a greedy thief who was actively bleeding the barbecue empire dry. And more importantly, my father trusted me. He deliberately hid his shadow ledger and the secret safe deposit key because he knew I was the only person in the entire family with the professional skills and the moral courage to stop his oldest son. He had intentionally left me a secret treasure map, knowing my forensic accounting background would eventually lead me to decode the bizarre numbers in the planner and slice open the heavy leather binding. He had set a brilliant trap for Desmond, and he had chosen me to completely spring it. I carefully wiped the tears from my face and took a long, deep breath. The crushing depression and the deep, paralyzing grief that had been suffocating me for days instantly evaporated from my body. It was entirely replaced by a burning, fierce determination. I looked at the digital clock on my kitchen microwave. It was almost 6 in the morning. The dark city outside my window was beginning to wake up. I knew exactly how greedy and how fast Desmond moved. Now that the fraudulent will had been formally read to the family, Desmond would waste absolutely no time trying to consolidate all of the financial power. He and his expensive corporate lawyer would be rushing to the downtown courthouses and the major city banks the exact second they opened their doors today. They would use his fake status as the sole heir to legally freeze every single financial account connected to my father's name. If Desmond successfully locked down the entire estate, I would never be able to access the contents of that suburban safe deposit box. Whatever my dad had hidden inside that metal vault was the absolute final piece of the puzzle. It was the ultimate weapon I needed to destroy the fake will in the probate court and send my corrupt brother to prison. I could not afford to wait a single second. I stood up from the table and walked into my bathroom to splash freezing cold water on my tired face. I changed out of my wrinkled clothes and put on a fresh, sharp, dark blue suit. I packed the yellow sticky note, the silver key, and the leather planner into my black leather briefcase. I walked out of my apartment, locked the door securely behind me, and headed straight for my car. The regional bank in the suburbs opened at exactly 8 in the morning, and I was going to be the very first person standing at their glass doors when they turned the key. The drive to the quiet suburban bank felt like the longest commute of my entire life. The morning rush hour traffic was just beginning to build up on the main highway, but I wove my car aggressively between the slow-moving commercial trucks and the sleepy daily commuters. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white under the pale morning light. I kept glancing down at the glowing digital clock on my dashboard, watching the green numbers slowly tick closer and closer to 8 in the morning. I knew exactly how elite corporate lawyers operated because I dealt with them every single day in my professional forensic accounting career. Desmond and his expensive attorney were not going to wait around politely. They were definitely sitting in a plush downtown office right now, drafting a comprehensive legal order to completely freeze every single financial asset tied to our father's Social Security number. They would blast that official fax to every major financial institution in the state the exact second the business day officially started. If that legal freeze order hit the local bank system before I got inside the physical vault, I would be permanently locked out of the safe deposit box, and Desmond would win the entire war. I pulled into the empty parking lot of the small regional bank at exactly 7:50 in the morning. The sky was still a pale, cloudy gray, and the air was freezing cold. I parked my car, grabbed my black leather briefcase, and walked straight up to the dark glass doors of the bank building. I stood there on the hard concrete sidewalk, shivering slightly in my thin blue suit, staring intently at the armed security guard inside, who was slowly drinking his morning coffee. The absolute silence of the suburban shopping plaza was a sharp contrast to the massive adrenaline storm raging inside my chest. I patted the side of my briefcase, feeling the solid outline of the leather planner and the small silver key. Every single passing second felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, at exactly 8:00, the security guard finished his coffee, walked to the front entrance, and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. I pushed through the glass doors before he could even step entirely out of the way. I walked directly past the main lobby seating area and marched straight toward the secure customer service desk, located right outside the heavy steel vault doors. A young female teller was just logging into her computer terminal for the morning shift. She looked up at me with a polite customer service smile, but I did not have any time for basic pleasantries. "I need immediate access to a safe deposit box," I said, placing the flat silver key directly onto the polished wooden counter. She picked up the key and examined the engraved numbers on the metal. "Certainly, sir," she said, typing quickly on her keyboard. "Can I please have the name on the account and your personal identification?" I handed her my driver's license and took a very deep breath. "The account is under Elijah, my father," I explained, keeping my voice completely steady. The teller clicked her computer mouse a few times, and then her friendly morning smile slowly began to fade away. She stared intently at her glowing computer screen, and then looked nervously over her shoulder at a loud, heavy-duty fax machine sitting on a desk behind the main counter. The machine was already whirring loudly, slowly printing out a thick stack of legal documents. I felt a massive drop in my stomach. The freeze order from Desmond's lawyer was literally coming through the physical phone lines right at this exact second. "I am very sorry, sir," she said, sliding my license back across the wooden counter. "The system is showing a hard pending flag on this specific account regarding a deceased account holder. A formal legal freeze is currently being processed by our branch manager right over there. I cannot legally allow anyone access to this vault until the estate lawyers formally clear the freeze in our system." I looked past her shoulder and saw the older branch manager holding the first page of the freshly printed fax. He was putting on his reading glasses to review the legal demands. It was Desmond's lawyer completely shutting down the estate. I had absolutely no time left. The heavy steel door of the vault was right in front of me, but it was completely locked behind a massive wall of corporate banking rules. But Desmond had made one massive fatal miscalculation in his evil plan. He thought he knew absolutely everything about our father's financial history, but he did not know about the obscure medical emergency from 5 years ago. When my dad had a minor heart surgery, he granted me a highly specific, durable power of attorney over his minor accounts, just in case something went terribly wrong on the operating table. He never officially revoked that legal document because we both simply forgot about it when he completely recovered. But as a forensic accountant, I knew that an unrevoked power of attorney granted before death could technically be leveraged in a very narrow legal loophole if the official death certificate had not been fully processed and verified by the local branch manager yet. I unzipped my briefcase and pulled out a heavily stamped legal folder containing the old document. I slapped the thick document onto the counter right over the silver key. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, leaning my body over the counter and using my most aggressive corporate accounting voice. "That pending flag on your computer screen is an automated temporary hold generated by an unverified third-party legal request. It is not a certified death certificate, and it is absolutely not a signed court order from a judge. I am the legal fiduciary of this account. This is a fully notarized, durable power of attorney that grants me total unrestricted access to all physical assets held within this specific branch. If you deny me access based on an incoming fax that your manager has not even finished reading, you are personally violating state banking regulations, and I will have my firm file a massive civil lawsuit against you and this entire bank before lunchtime today." The young teller stared at me with her eyes wide open in complete shock. The sheer force of my heavy legal jargon and my absolute unwavering confidence completely overwhelmed her basic corporate training. She looked nervously at the branch manager, who was still busy reading the second page of the incoming fax, completely unaware of the intense legal standoff happening at the front desk. She did not want to interrupt her boss, and she definitely did not want to face a massive federal lawsuit over a safe deposit box. She looked down at the official notary stamp on my power of attorney document, and then she looked back at the silver key. The loud whirring of the fax machine in the background sounded exactly like a ticking time bomb, counting down to my total destruction. I kept my eyes locked entirely on hers, projecting absolute authority and refusing to blink. Please follow me, sir, she finally whispered, picking up the silver key and grabbing her heavy master security ring. She quickly stepped out from behind the counter and walked me toward the heavy steel bars of the vault. She inserted her master key into the main lock, while I slid my silver key into the secondary slot. We turned them at the exact same time, and the heavy metal door clicked open with a loud mechanical thud. I stepped quickly inside the silent concrete room, leaving the nervous teller out in the lobby. Through the open door, I could hear the branch manager suddenly shout something loudly about an emergency legal freeze on an estate account. He had finally finished reading the facts from Desmond's lawyer and realized what was happening. But he was exactly 1 minute too late. I was already inside the secure vault, standing completely alone, surrounded by walls of small metal doors, and I was finally about to uncover the ultimate secret my father had left behind to save his legacy. The heavy steel vault door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a completely silent world of polished metal. The air inside the room was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and sterile dust. I stood alone in the narrow aisle, completely surrounded by hundreds of small rectangular safety deposit boxes stacked neatly from the floor all the way up to the ceiling. I looked down at the small silver key resting in the palm of my sweating hand. The engraved number on the metal was 407. I walked slowly down the long aisle, scanning the engraved brass plates on the front of each door. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I could actually hear the dull thud echoing in the quiet vault. I found box 407, located near the very bottom corner of the back wall. I knelt down on the cold tile floor and took a deep breath before sliding the silver key into the narrow lock. The mechanism turned with a satisfying heavy click. I pulled the small metal door open and carefully slid the long black metal container completely out of its dark resting place. I sat down right there on the hard floor of the vault, resting the heavy metal box flat across my lap. I popped open the hinged lid, fully expecting to see thick stacks of $100 bills or heavy gold coins or even bearer bonds that my father had secretly hoarded over the decades. But the metal box was completely empty of any physical wealth. There was no cash and no jewelry inside. Instead, there were only 2 thick manila folders resting quietly at the bottom of the container. For a brief, agonizing second, a cold wave of doubt washed over my entire body. I thought maybe Desmond had somehow gotten here first and emptied the box of everything valuable, leaving only useless paper behind. But as I opened the first manila folder, that lingering doubt was instantly completely destroyed. Inside the first folder was a massive stack of official medical records. But these were not the heavily redacted or completely fake logs that Desmond had been waving around the hospital. These were the actual highly detailed private medical files directly from my father's primary care oncologist. I carefully flipped through the crisp white pages, reading the complex medical terminology and the strict pharmaceutical schedules. My father had actively requested these comprehensive copies be sent directly to his private post office box months before he was ever transferred to the hospice facility. He knew Desmond was going to try to manipulate his medical state, so he secured his own independent baseline psychological evaluation. The final document in the folder was a signed affidavit from a top-tier state neurologist dated just 3 weeks before my father died. The neurologist officially certified that due to the aggressively spreading brain tumors and the required heavy doses of liquid morphine, my father would be completely legally incapacitated and entirely unable to comprehend or sign any binding legal documents from that specific date forward. That single piece of paper was absolute medical proof. It proved beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that the messy signature Desmond forced out of our father at 1 in the morning was entirely fraudulent and totally legally void. But the medical records were just the beginning. I set the first folder down on the cold floor and picked up the second manila envelope. This one was significantly thicker and sealed with a heavy red wax stamp from a private notary public. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a massive stack of heavy watermarked legal paper. I read the bold black text printed across the top of the very first page, and my breath completely caught in my throat. It was an irrevocable living trust. As a seasoned forensic accountant, I knew exactly what that meant in the eyes of the law. A living trust is an incredibly powerful legal entity that entirely bypasses the standard probate court process. It legally supersedes and completely overrides any last will and testament written before or after it is formally established. I quickly scanned the dates and the official signatures on the trust document. My father had secretly established this bulletproof legal fortress over a full year ago, when his mind was still completely sharp and his health was mostly stable. He had quietly transferred the physical deeds to all 5 commercial real estate properties, the complete ownership rights to the barbecue franchise, and every single corporate bank account directly into this ironclad trust. And right there on the 3rd page, listed under the sole managing trustee position, was my exact name. My father had legally handed me the absolute total control of his entire life legacy over a year ago. The sheer, unmatched brilliance of his master plan hit me like a massive physical shockwave. He knew Desmond was going to try to steal the company using a fake will. He knew Desmond would try to cut me out of the family and bribe the relatives to look the other way. So my father just let him do it. He played the role of the weak, dying old man perfectly. He let Desmond run around the hospital room playing his evil little games and making his fake power plays. Because my father knew that a fake will meant absolutely nothing if there was nothing left in the estate to actually inherit. By moving everything into the living trust, my father had essentially emptied the entire estate long before he even got sick. The fake will Desmond forced him to sign was totally, completely useless because it was attempting to govern assets that my father no longer legally owned as an individual person. I sat there on the floor of the bank vault staring at the papers in my trembling hands. I was holding an absolute nuclear bomb. Desmond had spent the last 6 months building a massive house of cards using stolen money, fake police reports, and manipulative white tears. He thought he was a criminal mastermind who had successfully stolen a multi-million-dollar empire from right under my nose. But he was actually just a pathetic, greedy fool who had fallen directly into the greatest legal trap ever set by a dying man. This living trust, coupled with the coded shadow ledger proving his embezzlement, was more than enough to destroy the fake will. It was enough to send Desmond to federal prison for a very long time. I carefully placed the medical records and the living trust back into their manila folders. I slid them securely into my black leather briefcase right next to the dark brown leather planner. I closed the empty metal safety deposit box, pushed it back into the wall, and locked the small door. I stood up and brushed the dust off the knees of my dark blue suit. I felt taller and stronger than I had in my entire life. The fear and the crushing anxiety that had plagued me for days were completely gone. I walked back toward the heavy steel door of the vault and knocked firmly on the metal bars. The young teller quickly opened the gate and looked at me with wide, nervous eyes, expecting me to be in serious legal trouble. But I just smiled politely at her and thanked her for her excellent customer service. I walked confidently out of the bank right past the confused branch manager who was still holding Desmond's useless fax. The trap was completely set, and it was finally time for me to pull the trigger. I walked out of the suburban bank with the heavy black leather briefcase gripped tightly in my hand. The cold morning air felt incredibly crisp and clean in my lungs. I felt completely reborn. I reached my parked car and unlocked the door, but before I could even slide into the driver's seat, my cell phone started vibrating aggressively in my suit pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who was calling me. I took a deep breath, letting my racing heart settle into a slow, steady rhythm. I swiped the green button and held the phone up to my ear without saying a single word. "Isaiah, my brother Desmond," said, his voice dripping with that familiar, sickeningly sweet arrogance. He sounded incredibly pleased with himself. "I see my corporate lawyers successfully managed to get that emergency freeze order pushed through the regional banking system this morning. You actually thought you could sneak out to the suburbs and steal some of Dad's hidden cash before I completely locked the entire estate down. That was a very pathetic and amateur move, little brother. I am officially the sole heir now, and I have absolute control over every single penny." I leaned back against the cold metal door of my car and stared up at the pale, cloudy sky. I am not looking for stolen cash, Desmond. I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I am looking for the absolute truth. And we both know exactly what kind of horrible truth is hiding out there. Desmond let out a loud, mocking laugh that sent a sharp spike of anger right up my spine. The truth is whatever my lawyers say it is, he sneered. And right now, the legal truth says that you are completely broke, entirely unemployed, and officially kicked out of this family. I just wanted to call and give you a quick update on my brand new property. I am actually standing in the backyard of the old family house right now. You should hear the beautiful loud rumble of the heavy diesel engines. My stomach instantly twisted into a tight knot. What are you talking about, Desmond? I demanded, my voice dropping slightly in pitch. I am talking about progress, Isaiah, he said, his tone turning completely cold and businesslike. I signed a highly lucrative preliminary contract with a major commercial real estate developer late last night. They want to completely bulldoze this entire property and put up a massive luxury condominium complex. I already have 2 heavy yellow bulldozers parked right here in the backyard, tearing up Dad's old garden. We are going to flatten this pathetic little house before the end of the week. The sheer disrespect was almost too much to comprehend. He was not just stealing the family legacy, he was actively destroying the physical history of everything our father had built. He was wiping away the home where we grew up just to make a quick, dirty profit. But I forced myself to remember the thick manila folders sitting safely inside my briefcase. I had the living trust. He did not legally own that property, and the developer's contract he signed last night was completely fraudulent. Before I could respond, I heard the phone being violently snatched away on the other end of the line. Chelsea's shrill, highly dramatic voice suddenly pierced through the phone speaker. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little parasite," she hissed, her voice completely losing that fake, sweet victim tone she always used around the extended family. "We are entirely done playing these stupid games with you. You came into my house and you completely terrified me. You tried to ruin my husband's incredible reputation. You are a complete, absolute failure, Isaiah." I listened to her toxic venom pouring through the phone, entirely unfazed. "You sound a little bit stressed, Chelsea," I said calmly. "Is the country club membership getting a little too expensive for you to maintain?" She gasped loudly, clearly, deeply offended by my calm tone. "You have absolutely no right to speak to me like that," she screamed. "We hold all of the legal cards. You do not have a single dime to hire a decent lawyer to fight us. You are going to be permanently living on the streets by next month. But because my husband is an incredibly generous and forgiving man, we are willing to offer you a tiny piece of charity." "A tiny piece of charity," I repeated, letting the utter ridiculousness of her words hang in the air. "Yes," she snapped aggressively. "Desmond's corporate lawyer drafted a very simple legal waiver this morning. If you come downtown and sign away your legal right to permanently contest the final will, we will write you a personal check for exactly $5,000. You can use that pathetic little handout to pay your overdue rent and go completely away. If you refuse, we will legally bury you so deep in corporate court fees that you will never physically recover. That is our final offer. Take the $5,000 and disappear forever, or we crush you completely." It was the ultimate filthy ultimatum. They were literally trying to buy my total silence for pennies on the dollar, while they prepared to illegally bulldoze my childhood home and steal a multi-million-dollar business franchise. A few days ago, that vicious threat would have completely broken me. I would have been terrified of the massive legal debt and the total destruction of my professional career. But today, I was holding the exact key to their entire downfall. I stared at my black leather briefcase sitting safely on the passenger seat of my car. I let the silence stretch out over the phone line for 10 full seconds, listening to Chelsea breathing heavily on the other end. "Keep your $5,000? Chelsea?" I said, my voice sounding like solid ice. "You are definitely going to need it to pay for your own criminal defense attorney." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Desmond shouted violently, snatching the phone back from his wife. "Are you actually threatening me again, Isaiah? I will have the police arrest you right now. I am not threatening anyone, Desmond, I replied smoothly, opening my car door and sliding into the driver's seat. I am just giving you a polite professional heads up. I am not going to sign your pathetic little waiver, and I am absolutely not going to disappear. I will see both of you and your expensive corporate lawyer tomorrow morning at the probate court. Make sure you wear your very best tailored suit, Desmond. You are going to want to look your absolute best for the judge. I pressed the red button and ended the call, completely cutting off his angry shouting. I tossed the cell phone onto the passenger seat next to my briefcase and started the car engine. The game of intimidation was officially over. It was time to spring the trap. I drove back to my small apartment feeling a deep sense of absolute focus settling over me. The chaotic panic that had controlled my life for the past few days was completely gone. In its place was a cold, calculated energy. I walked into my kitchen and set the black leather briefcase on the wooden table. I did not bother turning on the main overhead light. The pale gray afternoon light filtering through the window was enough. I opened the briefcase and laid out the three absolute most important items I now possessed. The dark brown leather planner, the manila folder containing the medical records, and the heavy red wax-sealed envelope holding the irrevocable living trust. I spent the next 3 hours organizing the paperwork with the extreme precision of a top-tier forensic accountant. I created 3 separate highly detailed legal binders. One binder for the judge, one binder for Desmond's expensive corporate lawyer, and one binder for myself. I carefully placed the copies of the medical records into the first section of each binder, explicitly highlighting the exact timeline of the heavy morphine doses and the neurologist's sworn affidavit of total incapacitation. In the second section, I inserted pristine copies of the living trust, making sure the dates and my father's signature were perfectly visible. But I knew the living trust and the medical records were only enough to invalidate the fake will and legally secure the estate. They were not enough to ensure Desmond actually faced real criminal consequences for what he had done. I needed to formally trigger a massive federal financial investigation to completely destroy his elite corporate reputation. I picked up my cell phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for: David. He was an old college friend who had worked with me at my forensic accounting firm for a few years before transferring to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We had not spoken in over 2 years, but I knew he was still highly active in investigating corporate embezzlement. I dialed his number and waited through 3 rings. When he finally answered, his voice was casual and friendly. "Hey Isaiah, it has been a long time, man. What is going on?" "David," I said, my voice low and completely serious. "I do not have a lot of time to explain everything over the phone right now, but I need a massive professional favor. I have absolute concrete proof of a multi-year corporate embezzlement scheme involving over $1 million. The money was systematically stolen from a highly profitable commercial franchise and heavily funneled through several personal credit accounts to fund a fake luxury lifestyle." The casual friendliness instantly vanished from David's voice, replaced by the sharp tone of a seasoned federal investigator. "Are you talking about one of the clients at your accounting firm?" he asked carefully. "No," I replied. "I am talking about my own brother, and he is currently trying to use a fraudulent will to completely steal the rest of my father's estate tomorrow morning in probate court. I have the entire coded shadow ledger completely deciphered and mapped out. I also have the exact dates and the specific cash withdrawal amounts that perfectly match the missing corporate deposits." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear David tapping a pen against his desk. "Send me the digital files right now," he finally said. "If the numbers line up exactly the way you say they do, I can easily get a federal judge to sign an emergency financial warrant by tomorrow morning. Where is this probate hearing taking place?" I gave him the exact address of the downtown courthouse and the specific courtroom number. I hung up the phone and immediately emailed him the massive encrypted digital spreadsheet I had created the night before, along with highly detailed photographs of every single page of my father's leather planner. I watched the progress bar on my computer screen slowly fill up, and when it finally said message sent, I let out a long, slow breath. The federal mousetrap was officially set. The rest of the evening passed in an incredibly tense absolute silence. I did not turn on the television or listen to any music. I simply sat alone in my dark apartment, staring at the three perfectly organized legal binders sitting on the kitchen table. I thought about my father. I thought about the decades of back-breaking work he had endured standing over hot, smoky barbecue pits just to build a legacy he could leave behind for his children. And I thought about how incredibly close Desmond had come to burning that entire legacy to the ground in a matter of days. I walked into my bedroom and carefully laid out my clothes for the next morning. A sharp, charcoal gray tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, and a solid, dark blue silk tie. It was my absolute best power suit. The armor I wore when I needed to project total, undeniable authority in a corporate boardroom. I needed to walk into that courthouse tomorrow looking exactly like the highly successful managing trustee my father knew I was. Not the broken, exiled son Desmond was desperately trying to make me. I finally laid down in my bed around midnight, but sleep was completely impossible. My mind kept violently replaying every single horrible thing that had happened since Nurse Brenda called me at 1:17 in the morning. The violent struggle in the hospital room, Chelsea's highly manipulative fake tears, the incredibly arrogant smile on Desmond's face when the security guards dragged me away from my dying father, the total betrayal of my aunts and uncles sitting in the living room of my childhood home. They had all completely bought into the vicious lies, and they had all gleefully chosen the promise of stolen money over their own flesh and blood. I watched the shadows slowly crawl across my bedroom ceiling as the hours ticked by. I did not feel any fear about the upcoming legal battle. I only felt a cold, deep anticipation. Desmond thought he had completely won the war. He thought he had successfully cornered me and financially starved me into total submission. He was probably sleeping incredibly soundly right now, dreaming about the millions of dollars he thought he was going to collect tomorrow. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 48 hours entirely rewriting the rules of his dirty game. The sun finally began to rise, casting a pale morning light across the city skyline. I got out of bed, took a freezing cold shower, and put on the charcoal suit. I grabbed the black leather briefcase and walked out the door. The time for hiding in the shadows was completely over. It was time to go to court. The massive granite steps of the downtown county courthouse seemed to stretch endlessly upward toward the pale morning sky. I walked up those heavy stone steps, feeling the solid weight of my black leather briefcase in my right hand. The air was cold and sharp, but I felt completely comfortable inside my dark charcoal suit. I pulled open the heavy brass doors and stepped into the grand marble lobby. The echoing sounds of clicking heels and murmuring voices filled the massive open space. I walked through the security metal detectors with complete, absolute calm. As I gathered my briefcase from the conveyor belt, I looked across the crowded lobby and saw them immediately. They were standing near the grand sweeping staircase, looking exactly like a royal family holding a press conference. Desmond was wearing a brand new custom-tailored Armani suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. His silk tie was perfectly knotted, and his expensive leather shoes shined under the bright lobby lights. Standing right next to him was Chelsea, holding a bright orange Hermes Birkin bag tightly against her side like a protective shield. Surrounding them in a tight circle of absolute loyalty were my aunts and uncles. Aunt Vivian was wearing her best Sunday church dress, and Uncle Marcus had actually put on a suit jacket for the occasion. They were all smiling and laughing quietly together, entirely confident that today was the day they would officially become incredibly wealthy. I took a slow, deep breath and walked directly toward them. The heavy clicking of my leather shoes on the marble floor caught their attention. Aunt Vivian stopped laughing immediately, and her face twisted into a harsh, bitter scowl. She leaned over and whispered something into Uncle Marcus' ear. Desmond turned his head and saw me approaching. His arrogant smile grew even wider. He nudged Chelsea and she let out a loud theatrical sigh of pure annoyance rolling her perfectly manicured eyes. "Look who finally decided to show up," Desmond said, his voice echoing slightly in the grand marble hall. He looked me up and down, taking in my charcoal suit and my lonely black briefcase. "Where is your legal representation, Isaiah? Did you really come to a major corporate probate hearing completely alone? I guess that pathetic $5,000 charity offer we made you yesterday was not enough to hire a real lawyer." The extended family chuckled quietly behind him, completely enjoying the cruel mockery. Chelsea took a step forward, clutching her expensive handbag. "You should just turn around and go home right now, Isaiah," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "You are only going to thoroughly embarrass yourself in front of the judge. You have absolutely no job and no money to fight us. Just accept that your father did not want you to have anything." I stopped walking and stood perfectly still directly in front of them. I did not look at Chelsea or the greedy aunts and uncles. I kept my eyes completely locked on Desmond. "I do not need an expensive corporate lawyer to tell the absolute truth, Desmond," I said, my voice low and completely steady. "And the truth does not cost a single dime." Desmond laughed loudly, shaking his head as if I was a foolish child. "The truth is exactly what my expensive lawyer tells the judge." "It is," he mocked, pointing toward the heavy wooden doors of courtroom number 4. "And right now, my lawyer is going to walk in there and officially legally inherit an entire commercial empire. You can sit in the back row and watch if you want to. It will be a very good learning experience for you." He turned his back on me and confidently led his flock of greedy followers through the heavy wooden doors. I waited for a few seconds, letting the cold anger completely wash out of my system. Then I pushed the doors open and walked inside. The courtroom was incredibly intimidating, with dark wood-paneled walls and high vaulted ceilings. The family took up the entire first 2 rows of wooden benches, sitting closely together and whispering excitedly. Desmond and his slick corporate attorney sat at the large plaintiff table, directly in front of the massive wooden bench of the judge. I walked quietly down the center aisle and took a seat completely alone at the empty defendant table on the opposite side of the room. A loud, sharp voice suddenly announced the arrival of the judge. Everyone in the room stood up as a stern-looking older man with gray hair and black robes walked out from chambers and took his seat high up on the bench. He arranged his reading glasses and opened the thick legal file sitting in front of him. He asked the corporate attorney to state his business for the court record. Desmond's lawyer immediately stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He spoke with the smooth, practiced rhythm of a man who spent his entire life manipulating the law. "Your Honor, we are here today to formally execute the final last will and testament of Elijah," the attorney began. He held up the wrinkled piece of paper with the jagged, messy signature. "My client Desmond is the eldest son and the sole named heir in this legal document. The deceased was of completely sound mind and body when he drafted this document. He wished to leave his entire estate, including his primary residence and his commercial barbecue franchise, entirely to his eldest son, who faithfully cared for him during his final tragic days." Desmond actually reached up and wiped a completely fake tear away from his eye. Aunt Vivian let out a soft, sympathetic sigh from the gallery behind him. It was a perfectly choreographed theatrical performance designed to make the judge rubber stamp the fraudulent will and close the estate immediately. The lawyer smiled confidently and concluded his opening statement. "We formally request that this court validate this legal will and officially grant my client total executive control over all financial and physical assets, effective immediately." The judge nodded slowly, looking down at the paperwork. He asked if there was anyone present in the courtroom who wished to formally contest the validity of the document. I stood up slowly from my chair, picking up the first heavily organized legal binder from my black briefcase. "I do, Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtroom. "My name is Isaiah, and I am the youngest son of the deceased. I am formally contesting this document on the absolute grounds of massive medical fraud and severe elder abuse." Desmond's lawyer immediately scoffed and rolled his eyes, looking up at the judge. "Your Honor, this young man is incredibly disgruntled, and currently completely unemployed due to a pending corporate embezzlement investigation, he argued smoothly. He does not even have legal representation present today. I ask that you dismiss his contestation entirely, as it is nothing more than a desperate attempt to stall the legal process. I stepped out from behind my table and walked directly to the center of the courtroom. I am representing myself pro se, Your Honor, I stated firmly, holding the thick binder in my hands. And I have absolute concrete medical evidence proving that this will is completely fraudulent. The judge looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his expression turning very serious. He instructed me to approach the bench and present my evidence. I walked forward and handed the heavy legal binder to the court bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. Desmond's arrogant smile suddenly completely vanished from his face. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his lawyer. If you turn to the very first tab in that binder, Your Honor, you will see the completely unredacted medical records from the hospice facility, I explained, pacing slowly in front of the bench. I ask you to look specifically at the detailed medication administration logs from the final night of my father's life. The courtroom went completely dead silent. The only sound was the sharp rustling of paper as the judge flipped through the thick medical documents. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, my father was administered a massive critical dose of liquid medical-grade morphine. I continued, making sure every single person in the room heard the timeline perfectly. It was a palliative end-of-life dose designed to keep him completely unconscious and free of pain as his bodily organs shut down. The fraudulent document my brother is attempting to submit today is time-stamped at exactly 1:17 in the morning, just 17 minutes after a massive legal dose of heavy narcotics entered his bloodstream. Desmond's lawyer jumped to his feet, his face turning bright red. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted desperately. "This man is not a medical professional. He cannot testify to the legal mental capacity of the deceased." "He does not have to," the judge snapped back, his voice suddenly booming with authority. The judge held up a piece of paper from the back of my binder. "Because there is a sworn legal affidavit right here from a board-certified state neurologist. The affidavit explicitly states that the deceased was completely legally incapacitated and entirely incapable of understanding any complex legal actions while under this specific narcotic regimen." The judge took off his reading glasses and glared down at Desmond and his highly paid corporate lawyer. The anger on the face of the judge was absolutely undeniable. "This court takes allegations of elder abuse incredibly seriously," the judge said, his voice cold and sharp as a razor blade. "It is medically completely impossible for a man with this level of morphine in his system to knowingly, willingly, and legally sign away a multi-million-dollar commercial estate. This signature is an absolute complete fraud." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a loud, violent crack that echoed off the high ceiling. "I hereby completely invalidate this last will and testament," the judge declared forcefully. "It is totally void and stricken from the official legal record of this court." Absolute pure chaos instantly erupted in the gallery behind me. Aunt Vivian gasped loudly, dropping her purse onto the floor. Chelsea covered her mouth with both of her hands, her eyes wide with total shock. Desmond stood up from his chair, his chest heaving heavily, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. His massive house of cards had just completely collapsed in front of the entire family. His lawyer desperately tried to pull him back down into his chair, but Desmond shoved the older man away. He glared at me with absolute murderous hatred. He realized that his fake will was completely dead and that he had completely lost control of the narrative. But the arrogant greed inside of him refused to just surrender. He puffed out his chest and smiled a truly ugly, desperate smile. "Fine!" he shouted angrily, his voice echoing over the confused whispers of the family. "Throw the will out. I really do not care. If there is no valid will, then the estate automatically defaults to the state inheritance laws. That means everything is split right down the middle. 50-50. You might have ruined my specific paperwork, Isaiah, but I am still the oldest son, and I legally own exactly half of that entire franchise and half of that house by state law." He crossed his arms over his chest, looking incredibly smug again. He honestly thought he had just successfully pivoted to a brilliant backup plan. He thought he was still walking out of this courtroom as a very rich man. He had absolutely no idea that I had not even opened the second tab in my binder yet. I did not even blink at his desperate outburst. I simply looked down at my thick legal binder and slowly turned the page to the second tab. I pulled out the heavy watermarked paper with the broken red wax seal and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "You are absolutely right about state inheritance laws," Desmond said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly across the room. "If our father had actually owned anything when he died, the state would have divided it completely equally between us. But our father did not legally own a single dime when he passed away." I handed the heavy document to the court bailiff, who immediately passed it up to the judge. I watched the eyes of the judge widen as he read the bold black text at the top of the page. "That is a fully executed and notarized irrevocable living trust," I explained, turning to face my arrogant brother. "Our father secretly established it over a full year ago. He completely transferred the physical deeds to the family house, all 5 commercial real estate properties, and every single corporate bank account directly into that trust. The estate you are trying to divide today has an absolute zero balance. And if you read the second page, you will see that I am legally named as the sole managing trustee with absolute exclusive control over every single asset." Desmond physically stumbled backward as if he had just been punched in the chest. He grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden table to stop himself from collapsing. His slick corporate lawyer immediately reached for his briefcase, realizing that he was completely defeated and probably not getting paid. "You are lying," Desmond stammered, his voice shaking with absolute panic. "He would never do that to me. He trusted me to run the deposits. He loved me." "That is exactly why he did it, Desmond," I replied, stepping closer to him. "He knew exactly what you were doing." I turned back to my binder and pulled out the dark brown leather planner. I placed it gently on the defendant table. "He knew you were stealing from him. For 4 years, he secretly tracked every single time you skimmed money off the top of the weekly franchise deposits. He wrote it all down in this shadow ledger using a highly specific numerical code. I spent the last 48 hours decoding every single page. You did not just steal a few $100s. You systematically embezzled over $1.2 million directly from the Employee Retirement Fund to pay for your fake elite lifestyle." The crowded gallery behind me erupted into chaotic whispers. Uncle Marcus stood up, his face completely pale, realizing the 10% franchise cut he was promised was entirely built on stolen money. Desmond started shaking his head, frantically backing away from the table. "That is completely insane," he yelled, looking up at the judge. "He is making all of this up to ruin me. You cannot prove any of that nonsense." I did not have to prove it to the probate judge. Right at that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung completely open. 2 federal financial investigators dressed in sharp dark suits walked down the center aisle. Following closely behind them were 2 uniformed state police officers carrying heavy metal handcuffs. I had sent the decoded digital ledger and the exact bank routing numbers to my former colleague David the night before. The federal authorities had matched my financial data with Desmond's secret bank accounts in less than 24 hours. The lead federal agent stepped up to the plaintiff table and looked directly at my brother. "Desmond, you are formally under arrest for massive corporate fraud, felony embezzlement, and severe elder abuse," he announced, his voice cutting through the noisy courtroom. The 2 uniformed officers grabbed Desmond by his expensive Armani suit jacket and roughly twisted his arms behind his back. The loud metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the room was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Desmond completely lost his arrogant posture. He started crying and begging the officers to let him go, screaming that it was all a massive misunderstanding. Chelsea immediately saw her wealthy, comfortable life completely vanishing before her eyes. She fell back into her favorite, highly manipulative tactic. She dropped her bright orange Hermes bag onto the floor and burst into loud, hysterical tears. She rushed toward the judge, waving her hands frantically. "Please, you have to believe me," she sobbed perfectly, manufacturing her desperate victim act. I had absolutely no idea he was doing any of this. I am completely innocent. My husband completely tricked me and lied to me about where the money was coming from. You cannot hold me responsible for his terrible crimes. The judge looked down at her with an expression of absolute disgust. He had just seen her husband try to steal an entire estate using a dying man under heavy narcotics. "Save your fake tears for the federal prosecutor, Mom," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "The financial report submitted to this court clearly shows that your brand new luxury Tesla and your expensive country club memberships were directly purchased using funds stolen from the retirement accounts of hard-working barbecue restaurant employees. You are completely complicit in this massive financial crime." Chelsea collapsed onto the wooden bench, sobbing entirely for real this time, as the federal agents began reading Desmond his legal rights. They dragged my completely broken brother down the center aisle and out of the courtroom. As I packed my legal binders back into my black leather briefcase, Aunt Vivian and Uncle Marcus slowly approached me. Their faces were twisted into pathetic masks of deep regret and fake affection. They had just watched their golden child get hauled off to federal prison, and they suddenly realized I was now the sole legal owner of a massive commercial empire. "Isaiah, my sweet nephew." Aunt Vivian started reaching out her hand to touch my shoulder. We had absolutely no idea Desmond was doing such terrible things. We were just so blinded by our grief. "You know we always loved you the most. You belong with us. We are family." I stopped packing my briefcase and looked at her. I did not raise my voice, but my words were completely sharp and totally unforgiving. "You stopped being my family the exact second you chose Desmond's fake promises over the truth," I said, looking directly into the eyes of every single greedy relative standing there. "You willingly sold out my father's legacy and my entire reputation for a pathetic 10% cut. Do not ever call me your nephew again. If any of you ever step foot on my property or try to contact me, I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Now get completely out of my sight." They physically shrank back from me, their faces pale with total humiliation. They turned around and quietly shuffled out of the courtroom, leaving me completely alone in the silent space. I had successfully completely excised the toxic poison from my life. A few months later, the warm summer air was filled with the rich, delicious smell of slow-smoked brisket and sweet barbecue sauce. I stood completely alone on the busy sidewalk, watching the massive line of happy customers wrapping all the way around the block. The neon sign above the front door of our flagship restaurant glowed brightly against the evening sky. I had formally resigned from my prestigious corporate accounting firm. The corporate partners had begged me to return after the massive federal scandal cleared my name, but I completely refused. I had a much more important job now. I was running the family empire exactly the way my father had always intended. Desmond was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary serving a highly extended sentence for corporate fraud and elder abuse. Chelsea was completely bankrupt and facing her own massive legal battles, trying desperately to avoid prison time for receiving stolen goods. I walked through the front doors of the busy restaurant and listened to the loud, joyful sounds of my community. I looked up at the large framed photograph of my father hanging proudly right behind the main register. He was smiling warmly, holding his secret barbecue sauce recipe in his calloused hands. The massive legal war had been incredibly dark and terrifying, but I had successfully protected everything he built. I had used the exact same forensic accounting skills he taught me to completely destroy the greedy vultures who tried to tear us down. I am finally entirely at peace, knowing that his incredible legacy is perfectly safe and completely mine. The core lesson from Isaiah's story is the power of calmness and intellect when facing cruel betrayal. When pushed to the brink, turned against by his own family, and stripped of everything, he didn't let anger control him. Instead, Isaiah used his professional expertise, patience, and sharp strategic thinking to expose their lies. The story proves that greed and manipulation might win temporarily, but justice and truth will always belong to those who know how to fight. smartly maintain their personal boundaries, and firmly protect their rightful legacy. Have you ever had to stand up for what is right against injustice from those closest to you? Share your story in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more inspiring stories of turning the tables.